There is a moment when a famous story begins to feel wrong. It happens when you look past the horse. For more than 2 centuries, the Comanche have been remembered as if they appeared fully formed on the southern plains. A rider on the horizon, a bow in one hand, a herd moving behind him, fast, feared, and impossible to stop. That image is powerful. It is also incomplete. Before the horses, before the vast grasslands, before Spanish officers wrote nervous reports about them, the Comanche were somewhere else. They lived far to the north and west. They were connected to the Shoshone. They spoke a language from the same family. They moved through mountain valleys and dry basins where survival demanded a very different life. Then something changed. Within a surprisingly short stretch of time, they moved south. They mastered the horse. They built trade routes. They controlled movement across an enormous part of the continent. They became the center of a political and economic world that outsiders later called Comancheria. History books treated this rise like a sudden explosion. But explosions leave debris. DNA leaves a trail. And when researchers began comparing ancient remains from the Great Basin with genetic patterns found among later indigenous populations, the old story began to break apart. The first surprise was not that the Comanche had moved. Comanche history already remembered movement. Their language already connected them to Shoshone relatives. Archaeology had long suggested that Numic-speaking peoples expanded across the Great Basin during the last 1,000 years. The surprise was what came before them. The Great Basin was not empty. It was not waiting for the ancestors of the Comanche. People had lived there for thousands of years. They knew the springs. They knew the seed grounds. They knew which valleys could support life after a dry winter. They buried their dead there. They left tools, fibers, sandals, baskets, and traces of meals in caves that held the past like sealed rooms. For decades, archaeologists argued over what happened when Numic-speaking groups spread across this region. Did newcomers replace the older people? Did the older communities simply adopt a new language? Did families merge slowly until no clear line remained? Or had historians created a migration story from scattered clues that could never really be tested? Then scientists recovered mitochondrial DNA from ancient Great Basin remains. Mitochondrial DNA follows one narrow path. It passes through the maternal line. It cannot tell the whole story of a people. No single genetic marker can, but it can expose a break. And that is what the results appeared to show. The maternal lineages found in ancient Great Basin individuals did not match the patterns seen among modern Numic-speaking communities as closely as many researchers expected. Instead, the ancient pattern looked more similar to populations farther west, including indigenous peoples of California. That did not prove a simple conquest. It did not prove that one population vanished overnight. It did prove that the region had experienced real human change. People had moved. Population patterns had shifted. The ancestors of later Numic speakers were not merely the same isolated community wearing a new cultural name. Some form of migration had occurred, and it was large enough to leave a genetic mark. That matters because the Comanche came from the eastern branch of that Numic world. Their history did not begin when Europeans first saw them. It did not begin when they entered Texas. It did not even begin when they acquired horses. Their story was already in motion long before that. And this is where the mystery becomes dangerous to the old version of history. For generations, outsiders described the Comanche mainly through conflict. They were reduced to raids, battles, treaties, and defeat. Their rise was explained by one invention: the horse. Give a talented people horses, the argument went, and they become masters of the plains. But a horse cannot explain everything. A horse does not explain how separate bands formed alliances. It does not explain how knowledge moved across families. It does not explain why one people adapted faster than rivals who also had horses. It does not explain the older network of language, kinship, memory, and survival that existed before the first mounted generation. The horse was not the beginning. It was an accelerant. The people were already there. The skills were already there. The social bonds were already there. The ability to move through hard country was already there. The genetic evidence does not turn the Comanche into strangers from some lost continent. It does the opposite. It places their ancestors inside a deep indigenous history of the American West. A history filled with movement, separation, reunion, and change. That sounds obvious now. It was not obvious to the people who wrote the first textbooks. Those books preferred fixed tribes on fixed maps. One name, one color, one territory, as if human communities had always stood still and waited to be discovered. Real history does not behave that way. People move when water fails. They move when trade opens. They move when enemies press in. They move when new animals, new tools, or new opportunities change the possible shape of life. Names change. Languages spread. Families absorb outsiders. Old communities divide. New identities form. DNA does not erase those identities. It cannot decide who belongs to a nation. It cannot replace citizenship, kinship, culture, or the authority of the Comanche people to define themselves. But DNA can challenge the lazy idea that identity must be biologically frozen to be real. The Comanche were not powerful because they were genetically pure. No human population is pure. They were powerful because they could transform without ceasing to be themselves. That may be the most important clue in the entire investigation. The Comanche call themselves Numunu, the people, not the people of one horse, not the people of one valley, not the people of one frozen moment. The people, a living identity, a moving identity, an identity strong enough to survive migration, expansion, captivity, forced settlement, population collapse, and generations of outsiders telling the story incorrectly. So what did scientists finally test? Not one magical sample, not one secret skeleton labeled Comanche. The truth is more careful than the title. Researchers tested ancient DNA from the wider regions tied to the Comanche past. They studied genetic variation among indigenous populations. They compared those findings with archaeology, language, and tribal history. Each line of evidence was incomplete alone. Together, they changed the picture. The picture now shows a population history with layers, an ancient foundation shared with other indigenous peoples of the Americas, a later movement of Numic-speaking ancestors across the Great Basin, a separation from close Shoshone relatives, a rapid expansion onto the plains, then centuries of contact, adoption, intermarriage, loss and survival. This was not a straight road, it was a river system. Many branches, some visible, some buried, some cut off, some still flowing, and the deepest twist is still ahead. Because the genetic break in the Great Basin raises a question that archaeology alone could not answer. What happened to the people who were there before the Numic expansion? Were they pushed west? Were they absorbed? Did their descendants become part of the very communities that replaced them? And if that older ancestry survived inside later populations, could the Comanche carry traces of both sides of the change? The movers and the people already there, the newcomers and the ancient residents, the population that expanded and the population history it entered. That possibility rewrites the usual story of conquest. It suggests that history is rarely a clean replacement. A nation can carry the memory of movement while its genome carries fragments of older meetings that no written document recorded. This is why ancient DNA has become so powerful. It does not speak in legends, it speaks in probabilities. It does not give us perfect names, it gives us relationships. It cannot tell us what an ancient person believed, but it can tell us that the person belonged to a population nobody expected to find in that place. And sometimes that is enough to bring an entire historical model down. In the next part, we enter the laboratory. We will see how DNA survives inside ancient bone, why contamination can create false history, and what researchers actually found when they compared the people of the old Great Basin with the ancestors of the Numic-speaking world. Because the most shocking result was not that the Comanche came from somewhere else. Every people comes from somewhere. The shocking result was that their rise may preserve evidence of a much older population shift, one hidden beneath the most famous horse culture in North American history. And once that older world appears, the map stops looking permanent. It begins to look like evidence from an unfinished case. The horse made the Comanche visible to the world. DNA is finally making the world before the horse visible to us. A human bone can remain silent for thousands of years. It can lie beneath dry soil, inside a cave, or on a shelf in a museum archive. It can survive while languages disappear, settlements collapse, and the names of entire communities are forgotten. Then a scientist removes a piece no larger than a grain of rice, and the silence ends. That is the promise of ancient DNA. It is also the danger, because a damaged fragment of genetic material can expose a migration nobody recorded. But contamination, bad sampling, or careless interpretation can create a migration that never happened. So before asking what DNA revealed about the ancestors of the Comanche, we need to understand what researchers are actually reading. DNA does not survive like a sealed letter. It breaks apart. Heat damages it. Water damages it. Bacteria damage it. Time cuts it into smaller and smaller pieces. In warm regions, ancient DNA can become almost impossible to recover. The southern plains are especially difficult. Summers are hot. Soil conditions vary. Many remains are poorly preserved. The Great Basin offers better chances.
Right
Some
here,
caves remain dry for long periods. Cool places protect organic material. Teeth and dense parts of the skeleton can hold tiny traces long after most of the body has disappeared. Scientists usually search for DNA inside the densest areas. The inner part of a tooth is useful. A small bone near the ear is even better. It is extremely dense. It can preserve far more DNA than many other parts of the skeleton. But getting a genetic sequence is only the first step. The next question is whether the DNA is truly ancient. Every person who touches a sample can leave modern DNA behind. An archaeologist, a museum worker, a laboratory technician. Even dust inside a storage box can contain genetic material. That means the laboratory must treat every sample like evidence from a crime scene. Researchers wear protective clothing. They clean the surface of the bone. They work in special rooms. They test for patterns of damage that appear in old DNA. Ancient genetic fragments tend to break in predictable ways. Certain chemical changes appear near the ends of the fragments. These patterns help scientists tell old DNA from modern contamination. Only then can comparison begin. Researchers do not look at a sequence and see the word Comanche. Genes do not contain tribal labels. They compare patterns. They ask whether an ancient individual shares more genetic variants with one population than another. They measure distance. They build models. They test whether one population could have formed through ancestry from two or more earlier groups. The result is rarely a perfect answer. It is usually a range of possible histories. This is why the Great Basin evidence became so important. Archaeologists already knew that Numic languages had spread across a wide region. Today, this language family includes Comanche, Shoshone, Ute, Paiute, and several related languages. The languages are connected, but language alone cannot prove how people moved. A language can spread without a large migration. A small ruling group can impose its speech. Trade can carry words across communities. Families can adopt a new language while much of their ancestry remains the same. For years, that was the central argument. Was the Numic expansion mostly a movement of people, or was it mainly the spread of language and culture? Ancient maternal DNA offered one piece of the answer. The oldest tested Great Basin individuals showed a pattern that differed from later Numic-speaking communities. This suggested that the population structure of the region had changed. The people living there in the distant past were not genetically identical to the communities that dominated the region much later. Some migration had occurred, but the evidence didn't show a clean wall. It did not show an army arriving on one day. It did not show every older community disappearing. Human movement is almost never that simple. New groups enter a region. Some families leave, some stay, some communities merge, some adopt the language of their neighbors. Children inherit ancestry from both sides while growing up inside one cultural world. After several generations, the new society may look unified, even though its ancestry comes from many sources. That may be what happened during the Numic expansion. The ancestors of the Comanche were part of that larger movement. They were closely tied to the Shoshone. Their languages remained so similar that the relationship could not be ignored. But at some point, groups began moving toward the plains. This was not yet the famous transformation. The horse had not yet become the center of Comanche life. The southern plains were already occupied by other nations. The Apache were powerful in parts of the region. Wichita communities maintained farming and trade networks. Pueblo peoples connected the plains with settlements farther west. The landscape was crowded with history. Then horses began to spread north from Spanish settlements. That changed the distance a family could travel. It changed hunting, it changed trade, it changed the balance between groups that had once been separated by days of walking. For the ancestors of the Comanche, the horse was not simply a new tool. It opened a continent. A rider could follow buffalo herds across enormous distances. A family could transport more food and possessions. A trading group could reach distant communities faster. A successful band could control routes, animals, and access to valuable goods. But again, the horse alone does not explain why the Comanche rose so quickly. Many peoples acquired horses. Few created anything like Comancheria. The answer may lie in the society that already existed before the move south. Small mobile bands were used to difficult environments. They knew how to survive without permanent settlements. They could divide when resources became scarce. They could reunite when opportunity appeared. Authority was flexible. A leader had influence because people trusted his judgment, not simply because he inherited a title. This made Comanche bands hard to control from the outside. There was no single capital to capture. There was no one ruler whose surrender could end resistance. Different bands could make different decisions. One might trade, another might move, another might reject an agreement completely. European officials often treated this flexibility as confusion. It was actually strength. The same pattern creates a problem for genetic research. There was no single sealed Comanche population. Bands interacted with neighboring nations. People entered through marriage. Captives could be adopted. Children raised inside a Comanche family became part of that family and community. Identity was social, cultural, and political. It was not a laboratory percentage. That fact destroys one of the most common modern mistakes. People often imagine DNA as a test of authenticity. They want a number. They want to know whether someone is genetically really Comanche. But no responsible genetic study can answer that question. Comanche citizenship belongs to the Comanche nation. Culture belongs to the community. Language, family, law, and shared history cannot be reduced to a commercial ancestry report. Genetics can describe population relationships. It cannot issue membership. This distinction matters because indigenous DNA research carries a painful history. For a long time, researchers collected human remains without meaningful consent. Museums stored ancestors as scientific objects. Samples were taken, studied, and shared without the control of the communities connected to them. Sometimes researchers made claims that contradicted tribal histories. Sometimes they treated those claims as more important than the voices of living people. That damaged trust, and the damage did not disappear when sequencing technology improved. Modern research increasingly requires consultation with indigenous nations. Some projects are designed with tribal leadership. Some use strict agreements about data control. Some do not proceed at all if communities refuse. This is not an obstacle to science. It is part of doing the science correctly. A sample is not only biological material, it may be an ancestor. The difference changes everything. It changes who has authority. It changes how results should be described. It changes whether a discovery becomes knowledge or another act of extraction. This is why there is no single dramatic experiment in which scientists gathered Comanche DNA and solved the entire history of the nation. The real investigation is broader. It combines ancient samples from the Great Basin. It uses linguistic connections between Comanche and Shoshone. It examines archaeological changes in settlement and material culture. It studies modern population patterns only where consent and responsible access allow it. It compares every line of evidence. And when those lines meet, the old picture changes. The Comanche were not a timeless plains population. They were part of a western migration. But they were not strangers to the continent. Their deeper ancestry belonged to the ancient population history of the Americas. Their ancestors moved across regions that had already been inhabited for thousands of years. They entered older human landscapes. They carried some lineages with them. They likely absorbed others along the way. Then, after reaching the plains, they transformed again. This means the rise of the Comanche was not the birth of a new people from nothing. It was the latest stage of a much older process. Movement, adaptation, separation, contact. Integration, the DNA supports the movement. Language explains the relationship. Archaeology shows the changing way of life. Comanche history gives the people their name, memory, and meaning. Remove any one of those sources and the story becomes weaker. Use genetics alone and people become data points. Use old documents alone and the Comanche appear only when Europeans begin writing about them. Use Hollywood and they appear as a single image on horseback. But when the evidence is placed together, something else emerges. A people whose history began long before outsiders learned their name. A people who moved through several different worlds. A people shaped not by one sudden invention, but by centuries of choices. And now the investigation reaches the most difficult question. When the Comanche moved onto the southern plains, they did not enter empty land. Other nations controlled the rivers, hunting grounds, and trade routes. Some remained. Some moved. Some joined new communities. Some suffered losses so severe that their earlier size became almost impossible to imagine. The next part is not about where the Comanche came from. It is about what happened when they arrived. Because DNA can reveal ancestry, but history reveals power. And on the southern plains, those two forces were about to collide. The southern plains were never empty. That is the first thing the old maps hide. Look at a schoolbook map from the early 18th century, and the land can appear almost blank. A few rivers, a few Spanish settlements, a few tribal names placed across huge spaces. But a name on a map is not a population. It is not a village, a hunting route, a trade agreement, or a memory passed from grandparents to children. Long before the Comanche became the dominant power of the region, the southern plains were already full of people. Apache groups moved across large areas of the plains in the southwest. Wichita communities lived in permanent settlements and grew crops. Caddo towns connected trade routes stretching east and south. Pueblo communities linked the plains with the desert and the mountains. Every river had a history. Every crossing had an owner. Every good source of water mattered. Then the Comanche moved south. They did not arrive as a massive army. They came in bands. Families followed opportunity. Hunters followed bison. Traders followed horses. The farther south they moved, the more the horse changed what was possible. A horse could carry a person farther in one day than someone on foot could travel in several. It could transport food, hides, tools, and shelter. It could make a hunting group faster. It could turn distance into protection. It could connect bands that would otherwise remain separated. The Comanche did not simply use horses. They reorganized life around them. Children learned to ride early. Families measured wealth in animals. Trade routes expanded. Mobility became a form of power. This is why the Comanche rise was so fast. They did not build walls. They did not need a capital. They created a moving system. Outsiders kept looking for a kingdom. What they found was a network. That difference confused almost everyone who tried to control them. But Comanche political life was not built around one ruler. Authority depended on trust. A leader could persuade. He could not simply command every band across an enormous territory. To outsiders, this looked disorganized. In practice, it made the Comanche extremely difficult to pressure. If one group lost access to a route, another route remained. If one agreement failed, the whole society did not collapse. The system bent without breaking. This was the foundation of Comancheria. Comancheria was not a country with fixed borders. It was a zone of influence. It covered parts of what are now Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. Its shape changed with seasons, trade, weather, and relationships. The Comanche controlled access to horses, bison, routes, and markets. That control did not come from numbers alone. Their advantage came from speed, information, and flexibility. The network could react before a distant government even understood that something had changed. This is where older histories became trapped by their own language. They called the Comanche only warriors. That word was not completely wrong, but it was far too small. The Comanche were also traders, horse breeders, negotiators, guides, and brokers between worlds that often misunderstood each other. Their power depended on movement through the entire system. Comancheria was not only military power, it was an economy. And economies leave genetic traces. Not in a simple way. There is no gene for trade. There is no DNA marker for political influence, but movement brings people into contact. Contact creates families. Families create ancestry. The Comanche world included people born in many different communities. Marriage connected bands. Adoption brought outsiders into Comanche families. People captured during conflict could later become members of the community. Some chose to remain. Some grew up speaking Comanche. Their children knew no other home. This matters because many outsiders imagined the Comanche as a closed biological group. They were not. They could be culturally firm and genetically open at the same time. That is not a contradiction. It is one reason they survived. A nation is not strong because no outsider ever enters it. A nation is strong when it can absorb people without losing its own center. The Comanche did this repeatedly. Their language remained Comanche. Their customs remained Comanche. Their political relationships remained Comanche. But the people inside those relationships could come from several ancestral backgrounds. Comanche identity worked differently from European ideas about blood. Belonging was built through family, language, loyalty, and life inside the community. DNA now confirms what that social history should have made obvious. Population boundaries were never perfect walls. The plains were a place of constant contact. The Apache had arrived from the north before the Comanche expansion. Their languages connected them with peoples far into the subarctic. That migration had already changed the region. Then the Comanche expansion changed it again. Some Apache groups moved farther south and west. Some remained close to Comanche territory. Some people crossed between communities through marriage, adoption, or necessity. The result was not a clean replacement. It was a complicated human border. The Wichita story reveals another side of the transformation. Wichita ancestors had built large farming communities on the plains. They lived in settlements, grew crops, and traded across long distances. European visitors described towns that surprised them with their size and organization. But settled communities faced a serious problem. When new diseases moved across trade networks, people living close together were especially exposed. A sickness could travel through a village faster than through scattered mobile bands. Population loss weakened old centers. Trade patterns changed. Communities that had once controlled large areas became more vulnerable. The Comanche did not create every crisis that reshaped the plains. Climate shifts mattered. Disease mattered. Spanish expansion mattered. The horse trade mattered. Changes in bison hunting mattered. The Comanche entered a world already being transformed. They were not the only cause, but they became the most successful power inside that transformation. This is where DNA changes the emotional center of the story. The older version presents one people replacing another. The genetic version shows layers. Some populations moved, some declined, some merged, some survived under new names. Some genetic lines continued even when an old political identity disappeared. Others became rare. A nation can vanish from a map while parts of its ancestry continue inside neighboring people. Culture and DNA do not move at the same speed. They do not obey the same rules. This is why ancient genetics must be handled carefully. A genetic similarity does not prove that two nations are the same people. A genetic difference does not erase a cultural relationship. DNA can show biological connection. It cannot replace history or oral tradition. It cannot tell us which songs were sung, which promises mattered, or how a child understood belonging. But it can show that a supposedly empty region was never empty. It can show that populations changed before written records began. It can reveal that the rise of Comancheria was part of a much older pattern of migration and mixture. The southern plains were not inherited by one people forever. They were shaped by generations of movement. The Comanche became dominant because they understood that movement better than anyone around them. But dominance is not isolation. Their power connected them to more people, not fewer. The Comanche genome, where it can be studied responsibly, should therefore look like the history itself. A strong pneumic foundation, deep indigenous ancestry from the American West, connections formed on the plains, later ancestry from other native communities, and after European contact, additional ancestry entering from several directions at different times. Not a pure line, a living record. This is what the old myth could not accept. The myth wanted the Comanche to be either untouched or destroyed. The evidence shows something harder. They changed. They absorbed. They lost people. They gained people. They adapted, and they remained Comanche. But the greatest change was still coming. For more than a century, the Comanche had used mobility as protection. They could move toward food. They could move away from pressure. They could choose when to trade. They could refuse a settlement that did not serve them. Then the system supporting that freedom began to collapse. The bison herds declined. Outside settlement increased. Pressure expanded. Disease continued to reduce communities. The open network of Comancheria was forced into a much smaller space. This did more than end an era of political power. It created a biological event. When a population falls sharply, DNA records the loss. Rare lineages disappear. Close relatives become a larger share of the surviving population. The genetic future narrows. Scientists call this a bottleneck. In the next part, we will examine the Comanche bottleneck and what it means. Not as an abstract graph, not as a cold number, but as the genetic shadow of a world compressed within a few generations. Because DNA does not only remember where people came from, sometimes it remembers the moment their choices were taken away. A population can survive and still lose part of its future. That is what a genetic bottleneck means. Imagine a library containing thousands of books. Every book is different. Some contain common stories. Others contain rare details found nowhere else. Now imagine that almost the entire library disappears. A few shelves remain. The surviving books can still tell a history, but many pages are gone forever. Something similar happens when a human population suddenly becomes much smaller. The people who survive carry only part of the genetic diversity that existed before. Common genetic variants may disappear by chance. Rare variants may become common. Entire family lines can end. The population continues, but its genetic possibilities become narrower. This process does not require total disappearance. It only requires a severe loss in a short period. For the Comanche, that narrowing happened after generations of expansion. At their height, Comanche bands lived across a vast territory. They were connected by language, family, trade, and movement. Different bands maintained their own leaders and routes. Their population was spread across a wide landscape. That structure protected diversity. Families lived in different regions. They met different communities. They formed different relationships. New people entered through marriage and adoption. The Comanche world was never biologically sealed. It was constantly renewing itself.
Right here, it
Then
has
the
to be
space
tight.
around them began to
It holds
close.
the spirit of the
Settlements
animal
expanded.
and the strength
Bison
of our
herds
people.
collapsed. Traditional trade routes became harder to maintain. Movement, which had once protected Comanche independence, became increasingly restricted. The change was not gradual from the viewpoint of a human life. A person born into a world of open movement could grow old in a world of controlled boundaries. A child could hear stories about enormous herds that no longer existed. A family that once moved across hundreds of miles could find itself confined to a small area. This affected food. It affected health. It affected family structure. It affected the number of people who survived to have children. And DNA recorded the result. Genetic researchers can estimate changes in population size by studying the amount of variation inside a group. They do not count every ancestor directly. Instead, they look for patterns. When a population remains large for a long time, genetic diversity tends to remain broader. When the population falls sharply, later generations inherit fewer variations. The genome becomes a record of survival through a narrow passage. This is the bottleneck. For many indigenous nations, the first major bottleneck began after European contact. New diseases moved faster than European settlement itself. A community did not need to meet a large group of outsiders directly. Disease could travel through trade. It could move from one settlement to another. It could arrive before anyone understood where it came from. The result was devastating across the Americas. But the timing was not identical everywhere. Some nations experienced major population collapse early. Others remained more protected because of geography or mobility. The Comanche had several advantages. They lived across a large territory. Many bands were highly mobile. They did not depend on one city or one permanent settlement. If sickness reached one area, another band might remain distant. Their political structure was distributed. There was no single center whose collapse would immediately destroy the entire society. For a time, this flexibility helped, but protection was not immunity. Disease still reached Comanche communities, loss accumulated. Then the destruction of the bison removed the economic center of Plains life. The bison was not only food, it provided material for clothing, shelter, tools, storage, trade, and ceremony. A society built around movement with the herds could not continue in the same form when those herds disappeared. Horses had once increased Comanche freedom. Now maintaining large horse herds became more difficult. Families lost access to the land needed to support them. Old systems of exchange weakened. Dependence on outside supplies increased. The biological effect of these changes was enormous. Food changed quickly, daily movement changed quickly, disease exposure changed quickly, living conditions changed quickly. But the human body cannot redesign itself within one generation. A population adapted to one way of life can suffer when forced into another. This does not mean there was one special Comanche gene for Plains life. Human adaptation is rarely that simple. It means that biology, culture, food, movement, and environment had worked together for generations. When the environment changed suddenly, the balance broke. Modern researchers can sometimes see this mismatch through patterns of health, but those patterns must be interpreted carefully. Genes are not destiny. A person does not develop an illness only because of ancestry. Housing, stress, income, access to medical care, food quality, and historical conditions often matter as much as inherited biology. This point is essential. For too long, science treated indigenous health problems as if they were caused by indigenous bodies. That explanation placed the blame inside the people. The deeper history shows something else. The conditions were changed around them. Land access was reduced, food systems were disrupted, communities were placed under outside control. Poverty and limited medical access continued for generations. The body carries the result of history. But history created the pressure. The bottleneck also changed family connections. When a population becomes small, more living people share the same recent ancestors. A surname, lineage, or maternal line may become more common simply because many others disappeared. This can make a modern population appear more uniform than it once was. That uniformity can mislead researchers. If scientists study only people alive today, they may assume the population always had the same genetic pattern. Ancient DNA reveals the missing diversity. It shows that earlier communities often contained lineages that no longer exist. This is one reason ancient samples matter. They do not merely extend the family tree backward. They restore branches that were cut off. But the scientific value of those remains creates an ethical problem. A laboratory may see information. A tribal community may see an ancestor. Both facts can exist at the same time. The question is, who decides what happens next? For much of modern history, scientists made that decision alone. They collected remains. They stored them. They tested them. They published conclusions without asking the communities most closely connected to the people being studied. That approach produced knowledge. It also produced harm. Today, responsible research is moving toward a different model. Tribal nations may help design the study. They may decide whether testing should happen. They may control how samples and data are stored. They may review how results are presented. They may refuse. That refusal is not proof that a community is afraid of science. It is an expression of authority. Consent is part of accurate research because context matters. A genetic result can be technically correct and socially misleading. For example, a study may find ancestry shared between two populations. An outsider may announce that the groups are the same. But shared ancestry does not erase separate histories. Most neighboring populations share ancestry. That does not remove language, citizenship, law, memory, or identity. A genetic study can also be misused by people searching for simple proof of belonging. A commercial test may report a small percentage of broadly defined Indigenous American ancestry. That result cannot identify a specific tribal nation with certainty. It cannot prove Comanche citizenship. It cannot replace family records or community recognition. The Comanche nation determines its own citizenship. A laboratory does not. The DNA story is important for another reason. It demonstrates that survival does not mean remaining unchanged. Modern Comanche ancestry may include traces from neighboring native nations, Europeans, Mexicans, and other communities whose members entered Comanche families over time. Some outsiders once used mixture as evidence that indigenous identity had weakened. The opposite may be closer to the truth. The ability to integrate people helped preserve the nation. A child adopted into a Comanche family could learn the language. That child could learn the responsibilities of the community. The child's descendants could become fully Comanche. Biological ancestry changed. The nation continued. This is not a failure of continuity. It is continuity in action. The bottleneck did not erase the Comanche. It made survival more difficult. It reduced genetic diversity. It placed more pressure on fewer families. It separated generations from language and traditional knowledge. But it did not end the story. Today, the Comanche nation remains a living political community. The language is being taught. Historical knowledge is being preserved. Ceremonies continue. Families maintain connections that survived every attempt to break them. This is where genetics reaches its limit. DNA can measure loss. It cannot measure determination. It can reveal that a population became smaller. It cannot explain why the people refused to disappear. It can identify continuity between ancient and modern populations. It cannot carry a language forward. People do that. It cannot rebuild community institutions. People do that. It cannot decide that survival will become renewal. People do that. The genome contains the bottleneck. The nation contains the answer to it. And this changes how we should understand the famous Comanche rise. The story is not only about becoming powerful, it is about surviving after that power was taken away. The mounted empire lasted for generations. The biological consequences of its collapse lasted much longer. They remain visible in population data. They remain visible in family histories. They remain visible in the questions researchers are only now learning how to ask responsibly. But one mystery remains. If the Comanche population passed through such a narrow genetic bottleneck, how much of the older Great Basin ancestry survived? Can scientists still separate the ancient pneumic foundation from later mixture? Can modern DNA reveal a clear path from the Western Basin to the Southern Plains? Or has the history become too complicated to untangle? In the next part, we will examine the two genetic routes that researchers use to answer that question. One route follows fathers, the other follows mothers. They do not always tell the same story, and when those two lines disagree, they reveal something far more human than a simple migration. They reveal who moved, who remained, who entered new communities, and whose descendants carried the oldest parts of the Comanche story into the present. A family can carry two histories at the same time. One history travels through fathers, the other travels through mothers. They may begin in different places. They may move at different speeds. They may even seem to contradict each other. But the contradiction is often the clue. To understand why, imagine your family tree. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and the number keeps doubling as you move backward. Most of those ancestors contributed some DNA to you, but 2 genetic paths are unusually narrow. The Y chromosome usually passes from father to son. It follows one direct male line. Mitochondrial DNA passes from a mother to all her children, but only daughters normally pass it onward. It follows one direct female line. These markers are useful because they change slowly. They can connect people across long periods, but they are also dangerous when presented without context. A Y chromosome does not describe every father in a family tree. It describes one father, then his father, then the father before him. Mitochondrial DNA does the same through one chain of mothers. After only a few generations, these 2 lines represent a tiny part of a person's total ancestry. That means a man can carry a paternal marker linked to one region while most of his other ancestors came from somewhere else. A woman can carry a maternal line thousands of years old while her language, nation, and family history were shaped by many later communities. The marker is real. The simple story built around it may not be. The 2 routes can disagree without either being false. One may preserve a local line, The other may record a later migration. Their difference is not an error. It maps how men, women, families, and identities moved through history differently. This matters in the Comanche investigation because there is no single Comanche gene. There is no paternal label that proves a person is Comanche. There is no maternal label shared by every member of the nation. Public research is much stronger at describing broad population history than at assigning one genetic signature to one living tribal nation. The official history of the Comanche Nation remembers movement away from Shoshone relatives and onto the plains during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Archaeology and language support that close relationship. Ancient mitochondrial evidence from the wider Great Basin also suggests that population patterns changed over time. But that evidence does not identify every ancient person as Comanche, Shoshone, or a member of any modern nation. The people in the oldest graves did not leave modern enrollment documents. Their DNA gives relationships, not names. This is where the maternal root becomes important. Ancient mitochondrial samples from the Great Basin showed lineages that differed in frequency from those found among later Numic-speaking populations. That supports some movement of people. It suggests that a new population pattern entered the region. But maternal DNA alone cannot tell us whether the change came from a large migration, repeated movement by smaller groups, marriage between communities, or a mixture of all three. Suppose new families entered a valley. Some local men and women left, some remained. Some marriages joined the groups. A new language became common. After several centuries, the population could look very different without every older lineage disappearing. Now reverse the pattern. Suppose many men moved into a region while more local women remained. The paternal markers might change quickly. The maternal markers might show stronger continuity. This pattern has appeared in many parts of human history. Migration is often shaped by social roles. Who travels? Who marries into another community? Who remains near relatives? Who gains political power? Genes can preserve the effect, even when no written witness survives. But we do not yet have enough public, community-approved Comanche genomic evidence to reconstruct every paternal and maternal path with confidence. That absence matters. It is not an empty space that a narrator should fill with a dramatic invention. It is a boundary. The responsible answer is that regional genetics supports movement and mixture, while the exact balance inside different historical Comanche bands remains more complex than any single marker can show. The bands did not all live in one place. They did not all meet the same neighbors. They did not all absorb outsiders at the same rate. One band might have stronger family links with Shoshone relatives. Another might include descendants of Apache, Wichita, Mexican, Spanish, or Anglo-American people who entered the community through marriage, adoption, or captivity. Their descendants could be completely Comanche in language, family life, and political identity while carrying different paternal or maternal markers. This is not genetic confusion. It is the expected result of real history. Then the bottleneck narrowed the picture. When many family lines disappear, the surviving Y chromosomes and mitochondrial lines become more common. A marker may look typical today only because other markers were lost. Researchers who study only living people risk mistaking survival for ancient uniformity. Ancient DNA can reveal that the earlier population was more diverse. But even ancient samples are limited. A burial site may represent one family. A cave may preserve one small community. A museum collection may contain remains chosen under old and biased practices. 10 ancient people cannot stand for an entire region. A careful scientist asks how the samples were collected, who they represent, and what they cannot tell us. Autosomal DNA adds a third root. This is the DNA inherited from all sides of the family. It is the kind most consumer ancestry companies examine. It can reveal broad mixture and relationships across many ancestral lines. But it is shuffled in every generation. The farther back an ancestor lived, the less predictable their contribution becomes. Two siblings can inherit different pieces from the same parents. A real ancestor may leave no detectable segment in one descendant after enough generations. So autosomal DNA gives width. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA give depth. None gives the whole person. When all three are combined with archaeology, language, oral history, and written records, the investigation becomes stronger. When one is used alone, the story becomes easy to distort. Here is a free method you can use today if you are researching your own family. Create 3 columns. In the first, place verified family records, names, dates, locations, birth records, marriage records, and census documents. In the second, place genetic evidence, autosomal matches, a confirmed paternal line, or a confirmed maternal line. In the third, place historical context, which nations lived in that region when migrations occurred, and whether the family story appears in records from that time. Do not allow one column to prove another by itself. A family legend is a lead, not a result. A small ancestry percentage is a clue, not tribal citizenship. A surname is a search term, not proof. This free evidence map will prevent most of the mistakes people make when they begin ancestry research. But this is only one part of the system. The complete system brings the records, genetic matches, ancient population studies, migration maps, and source checks together in the right order. I have put all of it together here. The link is in the description, but stay, because the most important part comes next. The final question is not which marker is truly Comanche. That question begins from the wrong idea. The real question is how a people preserved identity while their population absorbed new families, survived a bottleneck, moved across regions, and carried several layers of ancestry into the present. DNA shows that human lines cross. Comanche history shows that a nation can remain itself when they do. A paternal line may remember one migration. A maternal line may preserve an older local connection. Autosomal DNA may reveal later meetings on the plains. Culture binds those fragments into a people. That is why scientists must never use genetics to overrule the living nation. Indigenous data sovereignty means that tribal nations have the right to control the collection, ownership, storage, and use of their genetic information. This is not a footnote. It changes who asks the questions. It changes who keeps the samples. It changes who benefits from the answer. The most advanced DNA machine in the world cannot repair research built without consent. And the most detailed genome cannot define the Comanche more completely than the Comanche define themselves. In the final part, we will place every layer together. The ancient peoples of the Great Basin, the Numic movement, the separation from Shoshone relatives, the horse revolution, the rise of Comancheria, the mixing of families, the population bottleneck. Then we will answer the question promised at the beginning. Did Comanche DNA rewrite history? Yes, but not because it revealed a lost foreign origin. It rewrote history because it destroyed the idea of a simple one-line past. The result is older, more complex, and more human than the legend. And the final piece changes the meaning of the entire story. History wanted the Comanche to fit inside one image: a rider crossing an open plain, a bow pulled tight, a horse moving until the ground seems to disappear beneath it. That image is not false, it is simply too late. By the time outsiders saw the Comanche at their height, the deepest part of the story had already happened. Their ancestors had moved across the American West. They had separated from close Shoshone relatives. They had entered the Great Basin, where older populations had lived for thousands of years. They had carried some lines forward. They had met others. They had changed without losing the center of who they were. Then the horse arrived. The horse did not create the Comanche. It revealed what their society could become. Mobility became speed. Knowledge became territory. Family networks became political power. Trade became influence. Within generations, the Comanche became the strongest force on the southern plains. But power can hide the past. The more the mounted Comanche became, the easier it was for historians to forget the people who existed before that moment. Science has now forced the story backward. Ancient DNA from the Great Basin shows that the region experienced real population change. The evidence does not support a tale in which one people arrived and erased everyone else. Human history is rarely so clean. The older genetic patterns did not simply continue unchanged. Later Numic-speaking populations carried a different balance of maternal lineages. That means people moved. Some older communities probably left, some remained. Some merged with newcomers, Some family lines survived inside populations with new languages and new names. The result was not a blank beginning, it was a layered beginning. This is the first way DNA rewrote the story. It showed that the Comanche past cannot be reduced to the plains. Their rise began inside a much older Western history.
Stitch right
The
here. It
second
has to be
change came
tight.
from understanding
It holds the
identity.
spirit of the
For
animal
generations,
and the strength
outsiders
of our
searched for
people.
a pure biological type. They imagined one Comanche appearance, one ancestry, and one unbroken bloodline. But Comanche society was never a sealed container. It was a living nation. People entered through marriage, children entered through adoption. Captives could become relatives. Families from different backgrounds could become part of the same political and cultural world. This did not weaken the Comanche, it helped them survive. The genetic picture should therefore look like the historical picture. A deep indigenous foundation, a strong connection to the Numic-speaking world. Later links formed on the plains. Additional ancestry from people who entered Comanche families over time. The mixture is not evidence against identity, it is evidence of history. This is the third way DNA changed the old narrative. It destroyed the false choice between continuity and change. The Comanche changed constantly. They remained Comanche. Then came the bottleneck. The open system of Comancheria depended on movement, bison, horses, trade, and access to land. When those foundations collapsed, the effect reached beyond politics. The population fell, family lines ended, genetic diversity narrowed. The survivors carried only part of the variation that had existed before. Modern DNA can preserve the shape of that loss. It can show that a population passed through a narrow biological passage. But the genome cannot explain the full cause by itself. The cause was not a defective people. The cause was a transformed world. Food systems were broken, movement was restricted, communities lost land, families faced disease, poverty, and outside control. The body recorded the pressure, history created it. This is the fourth change. Genetics did not reveal an ancient weakness. It revealed the biological cost of historical disruption. The paternal and maternal roots add another layer. The Y chromosome follows one narrow line through fathers. Mitochondrial DNA follows one narrow line through mothers. They can preserve different journeys. One route may show migration, the other may show stronger local continuity. Autosomal DNA carries pieces from many branches, but those pieces are reshuffled in every generation. None of these routes can stand alone. None can define a nation. None can prove citizenship. Together, they can reveal patterns. They can show movement, mixture, loss, and relationship. But the final authority over Comanche identity belongs to the Comanche nation. This point matters because genetic science has often acted as if the sample mattered more than the person. Ancestors were stored in museums. Remains were tested without consent. Results were published without tribal control. The new science cannot repeat the old disrespect and call itself progress. A technically perfect sequence can still come from an unethical study. A powerful discovery can still cause harm if the community has no voice. The future of this research must include indigenous authority. That means control over samples, control over data, control over the questions being asked, and the right to say no. This is not a barrier to truth, it is part of the truth. The Comanche story does not exist only inside laboratories. It exists in families. It exists in language. It exists in law, memory, ceremony, and community. DNA can support that history. It cannot own it. So did scientists finally test Comanche DNA and rewrite history? The honest answer is more complex than the title. There was no single test that solved everything. There was no hidden gene that suddenly revealed a secret foreign origin. Researchers studied ancient remains from regions connected to the deeper Comanche past. They compared population patterns. They used language, archaeology, history, and genetics together. The result did rewrite history, but it rewrote it by removing the simple version. The Comanche did not appear from nowhere. They emerged from a long indigenous history of movement across the American West. Their ancestors were connected to the Numic-speaking world. Their expansion entered landscapes already filled with older communities. Their rise on horseback was built on skills, social structures, and knowledge formed before the horse. Their nation grew through both family continuity and the integration of outsiders. Their population survived a severe bottleneck. Their identity remained alive even when their world was compressed. That is not a story of purity. It is a story of survival through transformation. And this is where the old Hollywood image finally breaks. The famous rider is real, but behind him stand thousands of years of human movement. Behind the horse stands the Great Basin. Behind Comancheria stand older trade routes, family networks, and difficult choices. Behind the modern genome stand lines that survived migration, mixture, and loss. The Comanche are not important because they match one ancient sample perfectly. They are important because no living people can be reduced to a sample. Their history is larger than a sequence. Their identity is larger than a percentage. Their survival is larger than the myths written about them. DNA did not make the Comanche ancient. They were already ancient. DNA did not give them a connection to the continent. That connection already existed in their history. DNA simply forced outsiders to stop pretending that the story began when Europeans arrived to record it. The bones were not creating a new past. They were exposing how much of the old past had been ignored. That may be the real lesson of this investigation. History often begins too late. It begins when someone writes a report. It begins when an empire draws a map. It begins when a photographer points a camera. Genetics can move the beginning backward, but even genetics reaches a limit. Before the surviving sample, there were other people. Before the measured lineage, there were other families. Before the laboratory, there was memory. The complete story will never fit inside one paper. It will never fit inside one genome. But the evidence is now strong enough to say this. The Comanche past is deeper than the horse. It is more mixed than the myth. It is more continuous than the history books once admitted. And it belongs first to the people who carried it forward. Write a number from 1 to 6 in the comments for the finding that affected you most. 1. The Great Basin population shift. 2. The Comanche connection to the wider Numic world. 3. The role of adoption and integration. 4. The genetic bottleneck. 5. The different stories carried by paternal and maternal lines. Or 6. The fact that DNA cannot decide tribal identity. Send this video to one person you know who has repeated a family story about Native American ancestry but has never checked the records. One careful share may save that person years of chasing a false percentage and help them begin with real documents, real history, and respect for living tribal nations. In the next video, we will investigate the ancient DNA of the Apache and one migration trail that stretches from the American Southwest to the far north of Canada. The language connection has been known for years. The genetic evidence is now revealing when that journey may have happened, and why an entire population seemed to cross a continent almost without leaving a written trace.